Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Jacobson, who is an international speaker. He is a scholar. He is sought after around the world to speak. He's probably been in every continent, in every country where there's a Jewish community. Rabbi Jacobson, I told him earlier that a number of years ago, we had Farbrengens for the Russian Jewish community, and approximately 11 years ago, 12 years ago, we had different speakers who spoke Russian who would come here and farbreng for us. His father was here. Rabbi Jacobson's, Olav Hashalom's father, came to our Chabad house and farbrenged here. We have pictures of that. It was a beautiful evening, and now we have the great honor of hearing from Rabbi Jacobson himself. I also would like to let everyone know that he has a wonderful website called yeshiva.net, where this is going to be, or is being telecasted around the world, his speech at the moment. One final thought before I bring him up. Rabbi Jacobson was blessed by God with a brilliant artistic mind and with an incredible memory. He was, as a young child, gifted to have the front place. When the Lubavitcher Rebbe would speak for thousands of people on Shabbos morning, Rabbi Jacobson had the front seat. It wasn't even a seat, he stood to listen, to memorize, and to repeat the Rebbe's talks. At the age of 17 years old, I inherited my brother-in-law's spot. Because in 770 Eastern Parkway, you don't get a spot. You have to inherit. My brother-in-law moved to Orlando, Florida, and I inherited his spot. When I came into the spot on the first Shabbos, I was elbowed out of the spot because hundreds of people wanted that spot. And I was fortunate for about 2 or 3 years to stand 4 people behind Rabbi Jacobson. I don't know if he remembers, but behind Rabbi Jacobson, we had Rabbi Shalom Duchman. Next to behind Shalom Duchman I stood behind Rabbi Shalom Duchman to the left of Beryl Lazar. I didn't understand much. I was young. The Rebbe spoke brilliantly beyond my any type of understanding. But Rabbi Jacobson had the schus to stand there and listen and to repeat and to record the Rebbe's talks. With no further ado, Rabbi Jacobson, please come forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Kanakov. Good evening, dear friends, brothers and sisters. Welcome to all. You know, they tell the anecdote of a grandfather who sponsored his grandson to go each Sunday to Hebrew school, a Hebrew school connected to some Jewish temple. And one Sunday, the grandfather comes to visit the school and his grandson, and he meets his grandson David, and he says, "David, how are you enjoying the lessons in Hebrew school?" And David says, "Grandpa, they're really great, they're awesome. Are you learning, are you discovering Judaism?" "Yes, indeed, Grandpa, thank you." "So David, let me ask you a question. Who broke the tablets?" The boy looks at his grandfather and tells him, "Grandpa, I didn't do it." "David, come on, tell me right now, who broke the tablets?" "Grandpa, I swear to you, I had nothing to do with it. I don't know who did it. I was not part of it. I really don't know who broke those tablets, and it was not me." A very upset man walks into the classroom, confronts the teacher. "Are you the teacher of my son David?" "Indeed, I am." "You should be embarrassed with yourself. What type of teacher are you? What type of classroom is this? I ask my grandson who broke the tablets, and he tells me he didn't do it." The teacher looks at the man and says, "Listen, I've known your grandson now for 7 months. If he said he didn't do it, he didn't do it." An infuriated man walks into the principal's office. "Are you Mr. Cohen, the principal of this Hebrew school?" "Yes, indeed." "Well, you should shut down your school because it's a shanda. It's a disgrace." "What happened, sir?" "I asked my grandson who broke the tablets. He says, I didn't do it. I asked his teacher what's going on. He says, if he didn't do it, he didn't do it. What type of school are you running, Mr. Cohen?" Principal looks at him and says, "I'm so sorry for what happened. And I want to make a pledge to you right now on behalf of the board of directors. We will compensate you for the broken tablets." You just give us a receipt and we will pay for all of the damages. And we're very sorry for what happened. They once asked a Jew, what's the difference between ignorance and apathy? His response was, I don't know and I don't care. I share with you these two anecdotes because they are very emblematic of one of the great themes in the life of the person whose memory, whose life, whose contributions we explore and pay tribute to this evening. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, was born in 1902. The spring of 1902, in a town called Nikolaev in the Ukraine. On the other side of the ocean, at that very time, the Wright brothers were trying to create that unique instrument that would allow man to fly. And indeed, a short time later, December 1903, the Wright brothers announced the invention of the first airplane that would change the course of our lives in so many ways. This was the year the Rebbe was born, 1902. The year the Rebbe passed away was 1994. Almost a full century later. And the year when WWW emerged on the face of the horizon, changing our lives through the internet revolution and the World Wide Web. 1902 through 1994. Beginning with an airplane, ending with an internet. What a century it has been. The century has transformed human civilization perhaps more than in the 1,000 or maybe 2,000 years before. In the area of politics, in the area of science, physics, medicine, biology, psychoanalysis, psychology, wars, conflict, violence, and transformations on almost every level of human civilization and society occurred during those 100 years of the 20th century that literally transformed our planet, sometimes to a point where you wouldn't recognize it. But all of this paled in comparison to the transformations within the Jewish world from 1902 through 1994. I would point out this evening 3 great transformations that emerged in the last century during the lifespan of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. 100 years ago exactly was the beginning of the First World War. Until the Second World War, it was called the Great War. It was hard to imagine a worse war, of course, till the Second World War came about. 1914, when the Rebbe was a young child growing up in Dnepropetrovsk, Ukraine, or it was then called Yekaterinoslav before the revolution. Ukraine was always an exciting place. It's still an exciting place. I don't know if you always want to be there, but at that point, when one looked at the Jewish world, one realized that this is not the same Jewish world that existed for hundreds, for thousands of years. You see, in the first time in Jewish history, perhaps almost half of our people have been alienated from their heritage, from their faith, from their religion, from their tradition. This was something unprecedented in Jewish history. For much of our history, we were in the ghetto, physically and psychologically. Jews were forced to be Jews. They really didn't have a choice. So we were Jews because we had to be Jews. It was just what you were born into. You emerged a Jew and you left the world a Jew. But then suddenly, in the late 1700s, the walls of the ghetto came crumbling down. And with the advent of the Enlightenment, or known as the Haskalah, which begins in Western Europe, in France and in Germany, and then travels to Eastern Europe, it completely transforms the very fabric of the Jewish people, with the emergence of so many new powerful movements that capture the imagination of our youth, from socialism to communism, the Bundisten and secular Zionism, and so many other movements that seem to be so much more promising, isms that seem to be so much more liberating than the old ism called Judaism, caused millions and millions of Jews to explore modernity and in the process lose much of the link and anchor in the religious past of Yiddishkeit, of the life of Torah. This was the first major transformation in the Jewish world that never existed before, because the freedom that Jews were allowed also created an unprecedented crisis. Because the question was, would Jews be able to survive this? Or as the Lubavitcher Rebbe once put it, Jews had to deal with Siberia and Jews had to deal with suburbia. And often suburbia proved more challenging as far as Jewish observance was concerned. But all of this, of course, was a prelude to the second major crisis of the past century, where our people experienced its darkest moment, the moment of what we call today the Holocaust. A third of our people were decimated. 6 million Jews in Europe, including 1.5 million children. A rich, vibrant world, intellectually, spiritually, socially, was destroyed. Hundreds and hundreds of communities with such barbarity and sadism in a course of 5 short years. You could not recognize our world. And then there was a third major event, just 3 years after the Holocaust, with the creation of Israel in 1948. The Talmud says in Tractate Baba Basra, page 91, describing the funeral of Abraham, Avraham Avinu, Abraham, the first Jew. And the Talmud says that the leaders of the world came to pay respects to Abraham, and they eulogized him with these words. The Talmud says, they said, Oiloi la'olam sha'avad manhigo, Ola lisvina sha'avda kabarnita. Woe is to the world that has lost its leader. Woe is to a ship that has lost its captain. Why the redundancy if the world has lost its leader? That seems to be larger than saying a ship has lost its captain. But we all understand that to be a leader in the world is very different than to be a captain in a ship. Because a world without a leader is a different world, and yet there is some stability. But a ship without a captain is lost in a large sea, in a tumultuous reality, sometimes not knowing where the destination is, how to follow the stars, how to find your place in a turbulent, tumultuous, directionless sea. Abraham was not only a leader of the world, Abraham was a captain of the ship. About the Lubavitcher Rebbe, we could say he wasn't only a leader in the world, he was a captain of a ship in that insane century in which he lived from 1902 to 1994. He served as a captain of a ship. And I want to show this evening his direction or some of his perspectives on each of these 3 major crises that defined and transformed forever the Jewish world during his century. Number 1, the first crisis of mass alienation from Judaism. A third or maybe half of our people estranged to their own heritage. How does one deal with this? How does one confront it? Everyone had something to say about it. But the Rebbe had a unique message. And the best way to capture his message, I think, is by quoting that Kabbalistic teaching that the word for a leader, a Jewish leader, is nasi. Nasi. And the acronym of the word nasi is Nitzutzo Shel Yaakov Avinu. A spark of Jacob our father, because every leader is essentially a spark, a continuum of Jacob. Jacob had a very interesting family. We come from that family. So to understand ourselves, we have to understand Jacob's family. But there was one son who we know was unique. His name was Yosef, his name was Joseph. Joseph was not liked by his brothers. At the age of 17, he was thrown into a pit. And then he was sold into slavery. A prince became a slave in Egypt. There was no hope, naturally, for being liberated. He was a slave in the house of a man named Potiphar. And the Torah, the Bible in Genesis, the portion of Vayeshev describes how the wife of Potiphar took a liking to Joseph. She was enthralled by his charm, by his beauty. He was Yifat Torah, Yifat Mara, and she began to behave inappropriately, trying to seduce him, telling him each day, Shichva imi, come be with me. Joseph pleads with her. How can I betray you? How can I betray your husband? How can I betray God? How can I betray myself? How can I betray the principles of morality and integrity? But Potiphar's wife is insistent. And then the Torah says one day, Vayavo habayisa lasas malachto, Joseph came to do his work and no one else was home besides this woman. And the Talmud says, and Rashi quotes it, Lasos Trachav, that at that day, Joseph succumbed. He succumbed to her. And at the last moment, what happened? As the Talmud puts it in Tractate Sota, and Rashi quotes it, suddenly, Ra Dmus Yokno Shal Yaakov Aviv. He saw the image of Jacob his father, and when he saw the image of Jacob his father, the visage of Yaakov Avinu caused him to abstain, and he ran, he fled the home, Vayonas Vayetze Achutza, of course leaving his cloak in her hand, from which she proved that he behaved inappropriately and had him thrown into a dungeon in Cairo for 12 years. Joseph at last triumphed morally. He triumphed spiritually. The word the Torah uses for Joseph refusing to succumb to her temptations and her seduction is a unique Hebrew term, and it's the second time it's used in the book of Genesis, and it is vayima'in. Joseph refused, vayima'in. And if you're familiar with the musical notes in the Torah, that word vayima'in has a unique rare musical note that is only 4 times in the whole Torah called shalshelet. Vayima'in. And Joseph refused. Vayima'in. But what is the meaning of the idea that it was the image of Jacob, his father, that caused him to abstain? He did not know what Yaakov, his father, looked like. He spent 17 years with his father. He knew exactly what his father looked like before. And yet he still almost succumbed to her. What does the Talmud then mean that it was the visage of Jacob that he suddenly saw? And this prevented him. What did he now see in Jacob's image that he did not know before? Was it simply a picture that showed up in the window? What was it? The term for refusal, he refused to succumb to her, vayima'in, is used once more earlier in Bereshit, just a few verses earlier. And that is, in a previous story, Jacob didn't know what happened to his son Joseph, and the brothers brought him a tunic drenched in blood. And Jacob said, "My son must have been devoured. I will go down to my grave in grief." And what happens? The Torah says, all of Jacob's sons and daughters came to comfort him. Vayima'in lehisnachim. He refused to be comforted. Suddenly we learned that he had daughters. We never knew that Jacob had daughters. This is the first time suddenly he has daughters. Where were they? So the Or HaChaim writes that this was the comfort. In order to comfort Jacob, the whole family came, the sons and the daughters, and we could just imagine they all sat around the dining room table on Friday night. And they looked at Jacob and they said, "Listen, are you going to mourn for the rest of your life for Joseph? Look what a beautiful family you have. You have 11 sons. You have so many daughters. Look how many Eineklach, look how many grandchildren, look how many great-grandchildren, look how majestic, how dignified, how beautiful, how Jewish a legacy you're leaving. Okay, one boy was lost. There's always a black sheep in the family. But look how much good, look how much beauty, look what a beautiful family you have. That's why all the daughters suddenly come out. And what's Jacob's response? Vayima'en lehisnachem. Vayima'en. He refuses to be comforted. Why? So the Talmud says that God put it into the human psyche. Gzeira al hameis sheyeshtakach min halev. God planted in the human psyche that when somebody passes on, we don't forget, but somehow we could sometimes learn to move on, but not on a living person. And Joseph was not dead, Joseph was alive, and therefore Jacob could not move on, because Joseph was not dead, he was alive. What does this mean, my friends, on a spiritual or psychological level? Very often, there's a child in a family who falls into a pit or is thrown into a pit. I don't mean a physical pit. I mean the pit of addiction. I mean the abyss of a life of dysfunction, a life of self-destruction. Furthermore, this child is sold into slavery. This child is not anymore a master over his or her life. They are slaves to their instincts, habits, and addictions. Their lifestyles may be dysfunctional and destructive, and often one looks at them and says, okay, every community, every family has the black sheep, let them go. But there are so many other kids who are so beautiful, who are developing so well, who are studying so well, who are so entrenched in Torah and in Yiddishkeit. And that's what they told Jacob. So you have one boy, Joseph. You were unsuccessful with him. He fell into addiction. He's in a pit. He's a slave. Okay. But look what else you have. He can't come back. He's lost. Jacob refused to be comforted. You know why he refused to be comforted? Because he said, my Joseph is not dead. You don't know my Yosef. He's not dead. You never knew him. Joseph recognized his brothers, and his brothers never recognized him. Say the masters, they never recognized him. They never understood him. He was a dreamer. And his dreams were unique and exceptional and sometimes outrageous. And he couldn't fit into the cookie cutter model that his siblings could fit in, and he went to explore his own life. You never understood him, and therefore you gave up on him. But Jacob refused to believe that Joseph was dead. He refused to sever the cords with his child. He believed in this Joseph as a living boy, and not only as a living boy, as somebody who will ultimately bring life to the world. And what happens? Vayima'en. He refuses to be comforted. He refuses to declare his son dead. In another country, in Egypt, a 17-year-old is entrenched in a home of immorality and depravity. He has nothing to lose if he succumbs to the cravings of this woman who threatens him to torture him and kill him if he doesn't do what she wants. On the other hand, he has everything to lose if he abstains. And nonetheless, Vayima'en, he refuses. How does he refuse? The first Vayima'en explains the second Vayima'en. What gave Joseph the power to refuse Potiphar's wife's temptation is that his father refused to stop believing in him. His father refused to sever the cords with him. His father refused to say, my child is a lost case. My child is spiritually numb, frozen, paralyzed, dead. The father said, you don't know my child. I believe in this kid. And miles away, that kid was empowered to find himself, to discover his own soul, to say no to Potiphar's wife. That's the meaning of the fact that the image of Yaakov, his father, caused him to abstain. What was it? He suddenly saw that person, that father, that mother, who believes in him under all circumstances, who will never sever the cords, who will never give her hope, who will never believe that he is essentially alienated and bad and destructive. When he saw that image of Yaakov, his father, it allowed him to see his image in a new way. And ultimately he would become not only a great man, but he would become the person who would rescue and save the life of his entire family, save the entire Fertile Crescent from famine. Until today, he's the only one in our ancient history who's called Tzaddik, Yosef HaTzaddik. Not Abraham, not Isaac, not Jacob, not Moses. Yosef HaTzaddik, he is the Tzaddik. This was the Rebbe's, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's first response to the crisis that he observed. The crisis of a people that is confused, ambivalent, and so much of its youth surrendering to assimilation. Already in his early days, and then as this decades progressed, here in the United States of America and in the rest of the world, he observed this. And the Rebbe's first and basic response was, if you give up on the Jewish soul, you don't know what a Jew is. Vayemoin lehisnache. He refused to believe in the concept of survival of the fittest of the Jewish people. That the fittest of the Jewish people will survive and everybody else will be lost. The Rebbe said, you don't understand. Our boys, our girls, our little Josephs. If you believe in them, they will be able to believe in themselves. You just saw where a person comes to him in 770, but this happened hundreds, maybe thousands of times, and said, I came here to find a little bit of Yiddishkeit. And what did the Rebbe tell him? As du wirst suchen in dein eigenem Herz, wirst du gefinden a Sach mehr, wie du gefindest da. If you'll only search in your own heart, you'll find much more than you will find here. You don't have to come here to discover your God. You have to go into yourself to discover your God. And relentlessly, the Rebbe taught and pleaded, insisted and embodied, personified, cried and laughed, and most importantly, persuaded, reached out and demonstrated through words and thoughts and actions. That we live in a time that if you know how to speak to a Jew, you will realize that inside his or her heart there is an eternal and essential relationship with Torah, with God, with Yiddishkeit, with our history, with our heritage, with our faith. And the greatest crime would be to give up on any single Jew, to believe that they're truly alienated, that they're truly lost to our people. On the contrary, if you only put on the right glasses and develop the right perspective and communicate to them in the right way, with deep empathy, with deep insight, with wisdom and perspective, and most importantly, with love and deep acceptance, you will discover that, as he used to quote constantly the verse of Song of Songs, Ani yeshena v'libi eir, I may appear to be asleep, but my heart is deeply awake. And this went to an extreme. I mean, I heard there was a former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, is a man named Israel Singer, Yisrael Singer, a friend. And Israel Singer related that once, it was I think in the early 80s, he visited the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He came from a trip returned from a trip in the former Soviet Union. And he was giving a report to the Rebbe from life in former Soviet Union. And he tells the Rebbe, somebody took me to meet Lazar Kaganovich. He didn't know why the Rebbe was shocked. The Rebbe appeared to be in shock, hearing that he met Kaganovich. And the Rebbe turned to him and said, lebt noch, he's alive. Darf sein an alter Yid, he must be an old man. Yeah, he was in his 90s or very old. And the Rebbe says, go back to him. And tell him that he's a real Rasha. He's a wicked person. Aber kann noch hereinchappen und tun tshuva. But he can repent, he can do tshuva. Tell him to do tshuva. I was shocked. I never heard the Rebbe should call anybody a Rasha. This was very uncharacteristic of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where others used the word pretty freely. This one is a Russia, that one is a Russia. I don't know if ever the Rebbe using the word Russia. Very, very rare. It seems like a simple story. He sent Singer to go back to Kaganovich and tell him to do tshuva. Not if you know a little bit of communist history. You see, Lazar Kaganovich was a Jew who was Joseph Stalin's right-hand man. He was one of the great architects of Stalin's purges. Kaganovich stood at the right side of Stalin from his reign in 1924 after Lenin died till Stalin's death in March 1933. Stalin murdered around 40 million people and is said, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Kaganovich was a Jew who was brutal, who seemed ruthless. It's hard to find a Jew who was a criminal in the magnitude of Lazar Kaganovich and who suffered from the communists, the Jews who lived in the Soviet Union, especially the Schneerson family, who suffered terribly under the communists, and the Rebbe's own family, his own father, was arrested and exiled and so forth. This Kaganovich was responsible for untold deaths. He was a brilliant administrator and a brutal facilitator of Stalin's paranoia and absolute astronomical evil. He was involved with the hunger of the farmers in the Ukraine in the 1920s, which killed 6 million people. His own brother, Michal, was accused by Stalin for spying for the Nazis. And instead of his brother, Lazar, telling Stalin, my brother is innocent, he allowed him to die. And they asked Lazar Kaganovich, why didn't you show some kindness to your brother? He said, I did. I gave him a gun. And I told him he could kill himself rather than be tortured. That was the kindness that he showed his brother. When his wife once said, why don't you show some compassion to your people? He said, I don't have a people. Stalin is my God. The party is my God. The Communist Party is my God. Understand this. He died in 1991, I think at the age of 97. Now, 1957, Khrushchev removed him from all duties, all responsibilities, and people for decades assumed he was dead. No one heard of Kaganovich anymore. And suddenly, Senior comes to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who had an underground network in the Soviet Union for decades because of the many Hasidim who lived there, and it was completely underground. Nobody knew about it, not even Chabad Hasidim here in the United States. And here's that Kaganovich is alive, and here he says he is a Russia. But go back and tell him, imagine he can do tshuva. Where did the Rebbe get this from? Probably from Maimonides, the Laws of Repentance, who says that even Menashe, the worst Judean king who killed his grandfather Isaiah the prophet, at the end could repent, could do tshuva. Even a Jew who did terrible things his whole life, even if he can't change the past, on some level, can experience some level of repentance. This was the depth to which the Lubavitcher Rebbe believed in the Pintelayid. He believed in the essential spirituality and holiness, in the divine image at the core of every human being. Certainly people with not such a history, but the ordinary Jewish child. The Rebbe said, Vayimain, I refuse. We must all refuse to dismiss them as alienated from our people. And the word Vayimain is associated with which word? With the word imun, trust, confidence, with the word emuna, faith. You believe in the people and you empower the people. There was a second crisis the Rebbe had to confront, the whole Jewish world had to confront, the crisis of the Holocaust. Here, the Rebbe's message was very simple and very, very profound and moving. His message was, we must love in the exact same way that they hated. The hatred of the Nazi war machine was unique. It was rare. No Jew was considered too small, too insignificant, too valueless to be captured and destroyed. No Jewish community was considered too remote or too insignificant to be decimated. No Jew was considered too secular, too left-wing, too open-minded, too far from Judaism to be ignored. Every single Jew was seen by Hitler Yamach Shemai and his Third Reich as the embodiment of evil. I don't care if you're a child or you're an adult, you're a rabbi, you're a communist, you're an atheist, an agnostic, or believer, you're right wing or left wing. You're a baby in a crib. If you're Jewish, if you have Jewish blood flowing in your veins and your sinews, you represent the bacteria of the earth. And you ought to be exterminated. This was their philosophy that they practiced and they introduced into our crazy world. And the Rebbe came along and said, we must do exactly the same thing in the exact opposite way. Just as they would hunt down every last Jew in love, we must go and hunt down every last Jew. They hunted down every last Jew in hate. We must go and hunt down every last Jew in love. And never say, this Jew is not deserving of our love. This Jew is too small. This Jew is insignificant. This community is too remote. The love must be unconditional, and the love must include every single Jew, and not for any ulterior motives, but simply for the fact that they are Jewish, just like they were hated for no ulterior motive, that they're too religious or too holy. The very Jewishness is what inspired such hate. Their very Jewishness is what should inspire us to such love, to such affection. Will we say that they hate every Jew and we're not going to love every Jew? Will we say they hated even the smallest Jew and we're not going to love even the smallest Jew? Will we allow ourselves to think that there was no community too remote for him to pursue at the costs of his own war efforts? He took money and resources just to get the Jewish people. Will we say that one community is too remote for our unconditional love and embrace? My brother shared with me that he was once in London for a Shabbaton, and he was in a shul, and there was an elderly man sitting in the front row of the shul. And you know, sometimes elderly people are annoyed with children. But this Jew was exact opposite. Every kid who came running by him, he would stop him, he would call him over, he would give him a hug, he would give him a kiss, and he would tell the kid, the boy or the girl, I love you. And this happened throughout the whole services. And my brother was quite astounded with this custom. Where did he get this custom from? So he asked him about it. And the man shared with him an incredible personal tale. He said when he was a youngster, he was from Poland. He lost his entire family in the war. Entire family. He himself survived. He was very bitter. He was very angry. He was very hurt, of course. He had nobody. He was angry at the Germans. He was angry at the world. He was angry at Britain and America. He was angry at the Jewish people. He was angry, of course, at God. He was just so angry, and he made a vow he would never marry and he would never bring children to a world that is so evil and to a world that can behave this way towards a nation. He would never want his children to grow up at the risk of experiencing what he experienced. And he lived a single life in Britain, bitter, resentful, despondent, and angry, and alone. And once he was making a business trip to New York, I think it was the late 50s, and somebody suggested that when he's in New York, in Brooklyn, he goes and pays a visit to a rabbi, who they said is a rabbi who himself is a survivor of the Holocaust, lost many family members in the Holocaust, and somebody who is a very intelligent, bright, clever, and sensitive human being. What can he lose? He makes an appointment with Rabbi Schneerson, a young Lubavitcher Rebbe, at his headquarters in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, New York. He walks into the Rebbe's room, and he says he felt so at ease. There was something very accepting in that room, non-judgmental, very loving. The Rebbe asked him to sit down and to share with him his story. And he shared his story of everything he's been through. As you know, many survivors didn't cry because they knew that once they opened the faucet of tears, they would never be able to close it. They kept things inside, often for many, many years, sometimes for their entire life. This was the first time he opened his faucet. He cried, he wept. And the Rebbe cried with him. And he told the Rebbe about his vow, his anger, his resentment, his inability to come to terms with what he lost. Lubavitcher Rebbe looked at him and said, did anything survive? Did anything survive? He said, nothing. I don't even have the pictures of my mother, my father, my brothers, my sisters, my uncles, my aunts, my cousins. Not even the pictures, decimated completely. Nothing survived, nothing. The Rebbe said, but what about your love to them? Did that survive? He said, yeah, that's the only thing that survived, my love to them. So the Rebbe looked at him with tremendous compassion, and he said, and that's what I'm concerned about, because if you remain onto yourself, if you continue to live a completely secluded life, that love will remain in your heart alone. And ultimately, the only last remnant that the Germans could not take away from you and from your family, which was your love to them, will also be lost. So here is my suggestion. Go back to Britain. Find a nice Jewish young woman. Get married. Have a lot of children. And give them all the love that your mom and your dad and your siblings gave you and you gave them. Tell your children how much you love them and give them all that affection, all those feelings, all those emotions of love that you received from your family. Pass it on to them. And what is more, he says, I'll tell you, when you meet a Jewish child, tell them that you love them. Tell the Jewish child you love them. Give them that love, and that way, that love that you have to your family, not only will it not be destroyed, it will spread and spread and spread. He looked at the Rebbe. He says, Rabbi Schneerson, you're right. Have a good night. He left the room. He returned to Britain. He got married. He looks at my brother. He says, it's been decades now. Decades. And I sit in shul, and every boy and girl that walks by, I give them a hug. I give them a kiss. And I tell them how much I love them. I give them a piece of my sister's love, my brother's love, my mother's love, my father's love. It was unique. It was unique. But the Rebbe felt that in our generation, we cannot afford to behave and to live life in any other way but to live a life of absolute unconditional love to every Jew, and not conditional or dependent upon making them more religious. It's not like love them so that they could be more religious. And if not, no. The love ought to be unconditional because he or she is Jewish without strings attached. And the greatest celebration and opportunity is to be there for them physically, materially, psychologically, and emotionally. Of course, when you love somebody, you want to introduce them to that which you feel is so sacred and so powerful, namely Yiddishkeit. But that's not the condition upon which the love is based. And in this sense, the Holocaust for the Rebbe challenged us to introduce and internalize a new type of collective responsibility, a new feeling of responsibility and community, not just to our own, but literally to every single Jew. Interesting. A teacher who was in St. Paul, in Brazil, in St. Paul, related. Brazil is a pretty influential Jewish community, a developed Jewish community. Over the years, it's been developed very nicely. Chabad has been active there, other organizations. At some point, there were a few Jewish schools there, a few Jewish day schools. You know, the South Americans have a certain deep sense of tradition. The kids go to Jewish schools, different levels of Judaism. of Jewish observance, of Jewish study, but there were a few Jewish schools, and each of them was suffering economically terribly. The financial burden was difficult. And they decided to unite the schools, which was historic. All the schools will be operating as one, and that way you would cut, so much of the overhead, expenses would go down, everything would be fine. They came to the principal, who was a lovely principal, I think Rabbi Begun, who was an emissary of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Brazil. And they demonstrated this new plan, and he would be the principal. And he said, listen, I'm a chassid. I'm a disciple of a Rebbe. I have to ask my Rebbe. I consult him. He writes a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he says what they want to do. The Rebbe says, no. The schools should remain apart. He comes back and he says, I have to resign as principal. I'm so sorry. Why? Come along, do it. I can't. I can't betray my Rebbe. He told me not to do it. I as a chassid, I got to listen. So here are my papers of resignation. I'm so sorry, and I wish you great hatzlacha. They said, no way, you're not resigning. They loved him. He was impeccable. They had to be stupid to get rid of him. You're staying. He says, okay, but then I can't go along with this. And they were very, very upset at the Rebbe. The next time he was in New York, he went into the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he says, Rebbe, I have to ask a question. I am a chassid. I'm your student. So I have no issue. You said no is no, I'm good. But there's Jewish activists there. They're not Chabadniks. And they think it's absolutely absurd. Jews finally want to unite. How often does that happen, Right? And you say, no, you from all people, the Lubavitcher Rebbe? He says, what can I tell them? And the Rebbe looked at him and said, it's very simple. Jewish parents are picky. And they get upset fast. When Jewish mothers or fathers feel their children are not getting a good education, they call the school, they call the principal, they call the teachers, they call the board, they call the supporters, they call the donors. He says, I know a lot of Jews in Brazil. You're going to have one Jewish school, only one Jewish school, and there's going to be a mother who's going to get very upset at the principal, at the teacher, at the dean, at the curriculum, whatever it is. And she's not going to be able to make up with the school, or he's not going to be able to make up. What's going to be the next step? She's going to take out her child, and where's she going to put her child? In a non-Jewish school. And this child will never get a Jewish education. You need to give an option of another school. So if they get upset with one school, they could still go to another Jewish school. He came back to Brazil. He made a meeting with the board. He shared this with them. They froze. We have to admit, we weren't thinking of that. If she gets into a fight with the school, it's her problem. Let her go to therapy. Let her go to anger management. And that may be true. But a genuine leader often has a counterintuitive insight. You would think, great, bring it together. Who, like the Rebbe, spoke about unity? No one spoke as much like the Rebbe about unity, trust me, about Ahavat Yisrael. But in that sense, he thought about a kid, and that kid, trust me, is not a Chabadnik, because the Chabad kid is not going to a non-Jewish school just because you got into a fight with the principal. But he was worried about a family that's going to take out their child from a Jewish school, put them in a Bible school because you don't get along with a teacher. So you understand what level of commitment there is in that family. But the Rebbe was concerned. Lisbon, Portugal. Portugal is a tourist attraction. Today there's Chabad in Portugal. Many years there was not. And there was not one kosher restaurant. You know what Lubavitcher Rebbe used to do? The Rebbe made a deal with a fish restaurant in Lisbon. Listen to this. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, living in the Hasidic community of Crown Heights, Brooklyn, made a deal with a fish restaurant in Lisbon, Portugal, that he would send them money every month, and they should have a kosher section Non-Jews running a non-Jewish restaurant. So what would be the kosher section? They're not Jewish, no rabbi, no supervision. They're going to serve kosher fish there. Why? What was he thinking? Jews come to Portugal. These are Jews who in the house, they do some kosher. But out of the house, as many Jews say, in the house I'm kosher. Out of the house. I always tell them, your cutlery is going straight to paradise, that's for sure. With you, we got to figure that out. So you go to Lisbon, vacation is vacation, God is in Fort Lee, he's not in Lisbon necessarily. So things change, right? And the Rebbe is thinking to himself, so where are they going to go? They'll see a nice meat restaurant, right? And that's where they go. You're in Lisbon, what are you going to do? You can't get kosher sushi in Lisbon. So that's what you do. So what did the Rebbe do in order to minimize the experience of non-kosher and allow them to have some experience of kosher, even if it's not according to the full halachic standards, but at least kosher fish in a non-Jewish restaurant? He sent money to the restaurant in Lisbon to do this. Menachem Begin once shared. Menachem Begin became the Prime Minister of Israel in 1977. Till then he was the head of the opposition. And Begin used to often visit the Rebbe as a leader of that position. Then later he came as Prime Minister. And that year in 1977, in the summer, in August, and Begin once went into the Lubavitcher Rebbe and they were speaking about politics, about Israel. Begin came from Brisk in Lithuania. And the Rebbe came from the Ukraine. He spoke a Litvish Yiddish, the Rebbe spoke a Ukrainian Yiddish, and the two Yiddishes are very similar to each other, because Rabbi Shnei Zalman of Liadi was a Litvak. And they were pretty, they were good friends. And Begin was sitting by the Rebbe, and they spoke for a few hours about the situation in Israel. And at the end, as he's leaving, the Rebbe turns to Menachem Begin and he says, Ich will euch beten a persönliche Teuve. I want to ask you for a personal favor. Begin thought, sure. The Rebbe says, when are you going back to Israel? He tells him, how are you going back? He tells him, straight. My personal favor is, could you make a detour? Could you go through France? What's going on? The Rebbe said, I got a letter from a family. There's a Jewish girl who fell in love with a non-Jewish boy. She wants to marry him. And the parents are writing to me to ask me to try to help the situation. And I'm thinking what I can do about it. Here's my idea. If Menachem Begin could stop in France and go visit the girl and speak to her about Jewish identity, Jewish history, Jewish life, a Jewish family, a Jewish future, I think you'll have an impact. Especially in here, the Rebbe had a twinkle in his eye at times. With a twinkle, he tells Begin, especially, that I know that from the years when you were in the underground, you acquired a good French. So you'll be able to communicate to this girl in a perfect French. And that will make all the difference. And the Rebbe says, the expenses are on me. For the detour, for the flight, any expenses, taxi, whatever it is, your time. Menachem Begin looks, okay, Rabbi Schneerson, I will do it. If this is what you call a personal favor, if this is what you call a personal favor, I will do it for you. Usually when people ask for a personal favor, it's like, my son needs a job. And you're a dirty multimillionaire, so why can't you give him $2 million a year from your money? Right? A personal favor is called protection. If this is a personal favor, I will do it. Begin, who was a prominent politician at the time, before he was prime minister, stops in France. The Rebbe takes the address, he gives him the address of the home which they sent to him. He comes to this girl. The girl was a student of Israeli history and before 1948, and to see Menachem Begin at your door, in a good day, that would be a shocker, especially some city in France. She was overwhelmed. Why are you here, Mr. Begin? I'm here to talk to you about your future. He transformed the thinking of this girl. Menachem Begin was a passionate Jew and a passionate communicator of Judaism, of Jewish ideals, and a believer. The woman today is living in Jerusalem with a large Jewish family. But this was an approach that the Lubavitcher Rebbe didn't only live with himself, he really believed that all of us are capable of it in one way or another. He once shared with my father, my late father, who spoke here, as Rabbi Kanakov said, an insight. You know, in the beginning of the book of Exodus, it says about Moses. The first scene of Moses, he grows up, he goes out, and what does he see? He sees an Egyptian beating a Jew. And what happens? Vayifen kova kova yarki einish. Moses turns here, he turns there, he sees there's nobody present, and he strikes the Egyptian, he hides him, buries him in the sand, and he saves the Jew from a miserable death in the hands of an Egyptian anti-Semite. And everybody asks, what does it mean? He turned here and he turned there, and he saw there was no man. There was a man, because there was an informer who the next day went to Pharaoh and told him what Moses did. There was a man. So here's the Rebbe's interpretation. Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Jew. He turns there, Vayarki Einish. He saw there's no man. Not there's no man looking. There's no man who cares. There's no man who's going to stand up. There's no man who's going to take a stand and say there's no beating up innocent people. There's no man who's going to say this is evil. This is terrorism. This is going to be stopped. This will not be tolerated. And Moses then has to ask himself one question, and that is, will I be like everybody else? Nobody cares. I will be like everybody else. I'll send a check for $18. Or I will say, since nobody cares, therefore I will care. Since nobody's taking a stand, therefore I will take a stand. You see, in the Rebbe's world, we are all on a mission. We're all, so to speak, on an airplane, and the plane has a destination. But here's the key. None of us are passengers. We're all part of the crew. The passenger has the luxury to sit down, close his eyes, and say, don't bother me. The crew has to be attentive, has to be sensitive. And in our generation, with the loss of so many of our best, and with all of the crises that are face us, the Rebbe felt nobody can afford to say that they're small. Nobody can afford to say that they are not a leader. In his world, it wasn't the rabbis or the rebbitzins, the shluchim or the shluchais, the sages, the scholars, the writers, the teachers, the professors, the lead politicians who are responsible. In his mind, every single Jew ought to look in the mirror and see themselves as gigantic, see themselves as being a leader, because everybody could lead, can have an impact in their corner, in their sphere of influence. I was once at a conference about anti-Semitism, and somebody raised his hand and says, Rabbi Jacobson, I want to ask a question. What's the difference between Jews and anti-Semites? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they both don't like Jews. So I said, I'll tell you the difference. Anti-Semites don't like Jews, it's true. But go to us anti-Semite, I'm talking about a civil anti-Semite, if there is such a thing, right? And ask the civil anti-Semite, what do you think of the Jewish people? He'll tell you they're horrible. They are the vermin of the earth. They are responsible for all the problems. For example, the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, Israel's fault. Global warming is because of Shabbos candles. Of course, Sudan, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Egypt, of course it's Israel's fault. No question. So what's your opinion of the Jewish people? They're horrible, they're accursed people. 1 second, Mr. Richard Smith III. Dr. Weiss, your cardiologist. Different, unique, rare. Okay. What about your neurologist? Your neurologist is Dr. Schwartz. He's the most brilliant neuroscientist in the country. What about your lawyer? Your lawyer is Mr. Klein. He's also Jewish. Listen, he's an honest man. Your accountant is gross. He's also Jewish. Listen, this guy is one of the nicest people you'll ever meet. Your barber is Jewish. His name is Finkelstein. Listen. He's been my barber for 55 years. We're best friends. So what's your opinion of the Jewish people? Horrible people. The worst of the worst. What about all these Jews? Oh, they're unique. They're some of my best friends. They're different. They're individual Jews. They're good. Now come to a Jew and say, what's your opinion of the Jewish people? And any Jew will tell you, I love the Jewish people. Micha Amcha Yisrael, Goy Echad Ba'aretz. Who is like the Jewish people? I love my people. They're so holy. They're so beautiful. Tell me, what do you think about your brother-in-law? Aganev. What about the guy who sits near you in shul? Shakrin, a liar, a thief. What about your neighbor? A terrorist, a criminal. What about the neighbor on the other side? A compulsive narcissist, a gambler, an addict, an alcoholic, a mishigana. What about the guy who sits on the other side of the shul, near the gabbai? I wouldn't trust him with a quarter. And how about that rabbi over there? You don't want me to open my mouth? I could put him away for 20 years. What's your opinion of the Jewish people? I love the Jewish people. They're the greatest. They're the holiest. So I said, you see the difference? The anti-Semites hate the Jewish people. But sometimes he likes a few individual Jews. The Jews love the Jewish people, but we have a hard time with individual Jews. And this was one of the great insights of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, simple but profound. And he says, it's easy to love Klal Yisrael. But you know what? Don't love Klal Yisrael. Love Rebbe Yisrael. It's easy to love the Jewish people, but the Jewish people are made up of individuals. So instead of worrying about Jewish continuity and saying, I'm here to save the Jewish people, there is a Jewish teenager who lives right near you, who can use a hug. Why don't you go hug him? There's a young girl who is confused, who is uncertain, who's crushed, who's broken. Why don't you embrace her and give her hope? There are children you can inspire to get a real Jewish education. There's a family near you can invite to your Shabbos table. There's a Torah class you can create in your office. There's Jewish awareness, mitzvahs, the majesty and wisdom and depth of Jewish life that you can bring to family, to relatives, to partners, to employees, to friends, to your sphere of influence, small or large. And when people said, but nobody cares, he said, be like Moses. If nobody cares, so you care. And then there was the third unique event of our century, previous century, Israel. The creation of Israel, which for the first time in close to 2,000 years allowed so many Jews to return to our Holy Land and allowed the Jewish people to create a military, to create a Jewish government in our ancient homeland. Some of those components which have transformed the fabric of Jewish life. And here too, the Rebbe had a unique insight and a unique message, and I think it's best captured by that famous anecdote when Israel was struggling with its economy and some senior Knesset members met to discuss the crisis. And some of them suggested the following idea in order to build Israel's economy, and the idea was very simple: let Israel declare war on the United States of America. And America will wipe out Israel like it did to Germany and Japan. And then America will rebuild Israel as an economic superpower as it did for Japan and Germany, and we would do well. And one old Jew raised his hand and says, great idea, but one problem, and that is what happens if we win the war. You see, the Rebbe felt that political and military sovereignty alone, if it's not coupled with a profound moral understanding of what a Jew is and what the Jewish people represent, can often become very weak. Because what often happens is you become apologetic. Take Putin. Putin put his eyes on the Crimea, moved in his troops there. The world was screaming and hollering, and the guy barely gave a blink. Israel, 45 years ago, fought a defensive war, protecting itself against 7 armies that tried to destroy it and promised another Auschwitz. 20 years after the first Auschwitz in 1967, as King Hussein said, we'll throw the 3 million Jews into the sea. And they fought a defensive war. And those territories from which they were attacked, territories where they lived for 3,000 years, they liberated those territories, and 4.5 decades later, the Jewish state is still apologizing for winning the war. Somebody once said, you know what a Jew is? When a Jew makes a fist. Finally, when a Jew makes a fist, and it takes a long time. But when he does make a fist, the next step is Hashamnu Bagadnu Bazamanu. Al Chet Shechatanu. I'm sorry for existing. I'm sorry for living. They say Dr. Twersky was once on an airplane, dressed like a Hasidic Jew, a big round black hat, square black white beard, long black coat. Jewish woman looks at him and says, Du bist a Schande, you're a disgrace. If you would only dress like everybody else and speak like everybody else, there would be no anti-Semitism. But you refuse to be normal. You always have to stand out, and that's why they hate us. Dr. Twersky looks at her and says, excuse me, ma'am, I fail to comprehend the verbiage in which you're communicating. She was talking in Yiddish. I don't understand a word you're saying. What language are you communicating? You see, I am Amish. She says, oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you were Hasidic. No, I'm Amish. She says, oh, I love the Amish. He's like, that's so nice. Why? She's like, because you're such a minority, but you maintain your heritage with so much pride and dignity. More power to you. Keep it up. God bless you. It was now his turn to respond in Yiddish. He says, aha. Oy bich wollt gewen Amish. Hast du mich lieb. If I would have been Amish, you love me. Now that I'm Jewish, you despise me. I want to bless you, my dear friend. One day you should appreciate in your own that which you can appreciate in other people. You see, the Jewish world has been dichotomized for centuries by 2 different trends. One trend was, let's become parochial. Let's segregate. The walls of the ghetto crumbled. Let's rebuild our own artificial walls. Let's keep away from the larger world. Our job is to be a particular people, a parochial people, an exclusive people. Hein am levadad yishkon, we're a people meant to dwell alone. And another trend of Judaism, another trend of people was saying, no, we are cosmopolitans, we are universalists. Our job is to integrate. Our job is to become part of the larger conversation of humanity. Our job is to integrate into modernity, to go with the flow of modernity and not to escape it and transcend it. And these 2 trends in Judaism, you may call them the ultra-Orthodox and the more progressive denominations, or any way you want to phrase it, have been really at each other's throats. And it was the unique role of the Lubavitcher Rebbe who said that the very phraseology of the question is erroneous, because who says the 2 are mutually exclusive? He claimed it's the other way around. The more you're etched, the more you're rooted in your own essence, in your own Judaism, the deeper and wider and broader you can have an influence, not only on the world, on the Jewish world, but on the rest of humanity. And a great illustration for this would be the shofar. You remember the shofar? The shofar has 2 sides, the narrow side and the broad side. Did you ever try to turn around the shofar and blow it from the broad side? You ever tried? Well, I did. Take a shofar, turn it around, go to the broad side, put it in your mouth and go, ooh. And you know what it's going to sound like? Take the shofar from the narrow side and put it in your mouth and give a blow. Do, 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 do. You see, there are Jews who insist that they want to blow shofar from the broad side. They say, I'm not Jewish, I'm a universalist. I'm a universalist. I'm everybody. I'm with everything. But you know what happens? You have no voice. You have no distinct voice. You have no music. Your unique contribution that the world needs from you, you can't give because you have lost your voice. Your voice has been assimilated. It's been drowned. Your children grew up with ambivalence, with a confusion of identity. But if you take the shofar from the narrow side, meaning if you're completely etched and entrenched in 4,000 years of history, of Jewish scholarship, of Jewish thought, of Jewish wisdom, of Jewish life, of Jewish depth, of Jewish celebration. Then you'll take your shofar, you blow. Min hameitza karasi anani b'merchav, and then the voice will resonate far and wide, and it will expand, and expand far to the entire world, to the entire humanity. Because in the Rebbe's world, if the world is going to come to love the Jewish people, it's when the Jewish people will come to love the Jewish people. And if the world is ever going to respect and admire Israel, it's when Israel will respect and admire Israel. And if the world will ever come to really accept Israel and the Jewish people, it's when we will really come to accept and appreciate our own faith, our own heritage, our own history, our own God, our own Torah, and not be apologetic about who we are. He called it Gaon Yaakov, Yiddish Stolz. It's not about arrogance, it's about an awareness of who you are in the world, because the greatest tragedy, as Rabbi Adin said earlier a few minutes ago, is when you think you're a duck and you're really an eagle. You think you're a duck and you behave like a duck, and then you wonder why all the ducks don't like you. You're trying to fit in. You're trying to fit in, but the ducks don't like you. You're not supposed to be there. You're not supposed to be going, leave that for the ducks. It's a beautiful music. It's a beautiful song. It's just not your song. The Jewish people were chosen to be Mamlechet Kohanim V'Go Kodesh, a kingdom of princes and a holy nation, to be moral teachers of the world, to inspire the world, to elevate the world, and the world respects a Jew who's keenly entrenched and aware of his or her role in our world. So our Judaism doesn't make us exclusive. On the contrary, it gives us the voice that can blow the shofar and trigger a new consciousness, a higher consciousness, a soulful consciousness in the world. And so, tonight, we pay thanks. We say thank you to the Rebbe, a faithful captain of a ship that in the year 1902 found itself in a very turbulent ocean. And in the year 1950, when his father-in-law passed on and he took over the leadership of Chabad, found itself truly in a turbulent reality. And as a faithful captain, led the ship and showed all of the passengers the destination through his words and teachings, through his example and sacrifices, through his hours and hours and hours of sharing, through words and song, through laughter and tears, through passion and profundity. Number one, how to confront the crisis of assimilation and alienation. Believe in Yosef. Believe in those kids. Believe in their soul. Refuse to give up on them, and then they won't give up on themselves. Number two, how to respond to the Holocaust with a calling of unprecedented, unconditional love to every single Jew without any strings attached, just because he or she is Jewish, no matter who he or she is, where he or she is, how he or she is, what state of knowledge or observance they are. Unprecedented love and a sense of responsibility and a sense of unity and a sense of camaraderie without judgmentalism, but to care and everyone to know that they're a leader, not just concerned with the people collectively, but with individuals. And number three, when it came to the situation of Israel, the ability to rebuild not only a physical state, but a state needs a soul. A nation needs a neshama. And the neshama is what gives it its sense of dignity, its sense of pride. And when you have a lot of enemies, the worst thing is to be apologetic. And the worst thing is to become self-hating. Because when you live with doubt, you can't inspire confidence in your own, nor can you inspire confidence in the people around you. I want to tell you the last words I heard from the Rebbe. Lubavitcher Rebbe suffered a serious stroke in March '92. Stroke left him incapable of communicating verbally, of speaking, and paralyzed on his right side. For 2 years he was ill, and he passed in 94. He had a stroke from all places. You know where it was? He was praying at the gravesite of his father-in-law. He used to go there in later years, twice a week, to pray. Here, not far, in Montefiore Cemetery in Queens, he would go to the gravesite of his father-in-law, the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who passed away in 1950 in New York. And he would pray there. And it was a Monday afternoon, and standing there for hours and praying, he would bring a lot of the letters that he received, and he would daven there to Hashem for the people, and he would leave the notes there. He would tear them up and leave many of the notes there, and he fell. He had a stroke. The day before, it was Sunday, he would always distribute dollars for anybody who wanted to come, for counsel or blessing. I was traveling to Israel that day, that night, Sunday night. It was 26th of Adar, 1992, Adar 1, and I went to receive $1. And I stood there for a while watching. I just wanted to watch. It was fascinating to see. I didn't know it would be the last day, of course, the Rebbe would speak, the last day he would give dollars, the last day he would stand, the last day he would communicate in that sense. The day before, he gave a long, very powerful sermon, very powerful farbrengen, which I had the privilege of transcribing, of repeating, very powerful ideas. Just the day before, 2 days before his stroke, he was already, he was 90, he was almost 90. He was 89, almost 90. And in front of me, there was a little girl. And when I looked at her, I saw immediately that she's not from a Chabad family. It was very obvious. She was so cute. She was short, she was young, she was cute. She has these big bekalach, these big cheeks that are very, very endearing, you know what I mean? And the Rebbe gave her $1 and told her 2 words, bracha v'hatzlacha, blessing and success. And she looked him straight in the eyes, and I'll never forget, she said these words to him, Lubavitcher Rebbe, I love you. Now I have to tell you, his secretaries around there did not like it. They were like, what's going on? This girl is telling the Rebbe, these words. People wouldn't speak to him this way. But the Rebbe loved it. I have seen him smile many times, but the way I saw him smile that Sunday afternoon, I never saw him smile. From ear to ear, his holy face was radiating. There was such a kvel in his sacred countenance. And she finished her thing. She was, she was ready to leave. But the Rebbe kept her back. And with his sparkling blue eyes, he looked into her adorable, innocent, pure and pristine eyes. And he gave her a $2. And with a huge smile, he said, this is for the love. And then came my turn. He looked at me, grew serious. The smile was wiped off his face completely. You're laughing, but it wasn't so funny at the time. And his secretary, Rabbi Grona, told him I was going to Israel, and he gave me $1. He said, bracha v'atzlacha. And then he gave me a $2, and he said, abgeben av tzedakah in Eretz HaKodesh. You should give this for tzedakah, for charity in the Holy Land. And those were the last words I ever heard from my Rebbe. This is for the love. This is for the love. Those were the words he shared with that girl. Tonight, 20 years later, 20 years after his passing, 22 years after that moment, we gather here this evening together with Jews literally all over the world who are gathering tonight and tomorrow night and throughout this week and past week to remember, to pay tribute, to study, to explore, to reflect. But most importantly, to tell the Rebbe not only that I love you, but that love that you have inspired for so many decades, I and we vow that we will take that love and we will carry it, we will share it, we will spread it and we will follow your marching orders. The marching orders to all the people in the ship to reach the shores, to reach the destination. And the destination is nothing less than the redemption, than a world in which the true dignity and the true majesty of every human being is exposed. A world of wholesomeness, a world of goodness, the world that we and the Rebbe yearned so deeply for, the world of Mashiach. Thank you very much.